B-Sides Calgary, I'm Josh Sokol. I'm actually coming to you live from Round Rock, Texas, just north of Austin in the U.S. It's a pleasure to be here. This is actually my second year presenting to B-Sides Calgary. Started off last year, and I was supposed to come there in person. I was really looking forward to joining you all, and then COVID happened, and now COVID's still happening. So my hope is that I can submit a talk and get accepted again next year, and then I can actually be there in person. But in the meantime, hopefully the video will do. Let's see here. So our talk today is measuring cybersecurity maturity. I mentioned I'm Josh. I'm a CISSP. I've been running security teams for a long time. I actually retired from National Instruments about a year and a half ago, something like that, in order to focus full-time on SIMPLERISK. And SIMPLERISK is kind of my baby. I've been working on it since 2013. Basically in March of 2013, I actually presented at the B-Sides Austin conference. And I talked about risk management and everything that I'd learned. And the thing that I figured out is that there wasn't really a good tool to do it out there. Certainly not a good free one that didn't cost me $500,000. And so I kind of created my own. I've been involved with OWASP for a very long time. I was a former board member for the National Foundation. I ran the OWASP Austin chapter for a long time. I even founded a conference here in Austin called LastCon. Kind of areas of expertise are especially around GRC as well as secure application development lifecycle. By the way, so I have my kind of slides up here in front of me, and I'm not able to see the stuff that you guys are popping into chat. So I'll try and kind of flop back and forth so that I can read questions as we go, but please forgive me if I'm not answering them right away. In terms of what we're going to cover today, what's organizational cybersecurity maturity, how to create an effective roadmap. We'll talk about assessing current and desired maturity. We'll talk about risk, and then the roadmap piece. How do we get from point A to point B? So a little bit of background here. I originally gave this talk with a coworker. His name is Alex Pulamini, and he ran the IT compliance team at National Instruments. And this was the same time that I was running the security team at National Instruments. And we found out that we had a lot in common. There were a lot of kind of parallels between what he was doing and what I was doing. For me, on the security side, I was defining technical controls for the organization, and I was doing enforcement of these controls. Whereas for him, he was really looking on the compliance side. How do we define policies, guidelines, standards, and procedures? And how do we validate that we are in compliance with the defined requirements, whatever those may be? And so we were asked by our manager to assess our organization's cybersecurity maturity and to create a roadmap for NI's information security program. We had access to Gartner, and Gartner is awesome. It's really expensive. But they do have a really good maturity assessment that you can take, and it gives you this nice spider chart of where you sit. But it's really high-level advice. It's like, you should have somebody in charge of security. Well, duh, right? And say like, you should have an information security policy. You're like, yeah, I knew that. It doesn't really give you a roadmap of how do I get from point A to point B. And so that's kind of where Alex and I started on this journey. So before we get too far into here, we have to kind of understand what organizational cybersecurity maturity is. And organizational cybersecurity maturity really speaks to how effective the people, the processes, and technology are at mitigating cybersecurity risk, regardless of what that might be. And you have kind of two types of controls. So you got lots of types of controls, but controls kind of fall into one of two categories. Either you have mature controls or you have immature controls, and sometimes you have stuff in between. Immature controls are things that management shouldn't be placing a lot of confidence in because they're immature. Whereas mature, obviously, because they're more mature controls, you can place more confidence in them and whatnot. So a quick example is if you had an immature control, that might be an endpoint that has basic password protection. There's not a lot there to protect the soft, squishy stuff on the inside. But a more mature control example might be that same endpoint, but now we're adding full disk encryption, we're doing complex password requirements, we're adding in multi-factor authentication. You get the idea, right? We're adding in all these different things to mature this control and turning that from, kind of a soft, squishy center into more of like the M&M model into more of a jawbreaker model, something a little bit more solid. So how do we create the roadmap? Well, if you look at a roadmap, generally a roadmap says you start here, you're going to end up here, and then the map is just, how do we get from point A to point B, right? How are we traversing this thing? And there's lots of different paths as you go along, but everything from point A to point B is essentially your roadmap. So the first piece we said is we have to assess where we are. And in order to do that, we need to kind of identify the control framework that embodies what it is that we're looking to assess. And there's tons of control frameworks out there. Talk a little bit about that on my next slide. But understand, are we trying to protect our customers' privacy data? Are we looking at securing credit cards? Are we creating some super duper top secret system? Each one of these different things, each one of these different kind of environments are going to have different requirements. And so that's where we're going to start. So in our case, what we were doing is we were looking at frameworks that kind of center around kind of IT and cybersecurity. And we looked at NIST 853, 800, 171. NIST CSF had just come out at that point. So we were looking at that. ISO 27001, we all think of that as like the gold standard. Honest truth is it's probably anything but. It's pretty slim, pretty narrow. High trust is another one. High trust is proprietary along with ISO. And so, we looked at all these different frameworks, and when we started looking at, all right, what do we do here? We ended up selecting the NIST Cybersecurity framework. And the main reasons were it was free, right? We're not dealing with proprietary things like ISO or high trust or something like that. NIST is fantastic when it comes to best practices. There's a lot of controls, a lot of kind of requirements that are spelled out in there. And you look through them and you're like, yeah, we should do that. Yeah, we should do that. Absolutely. And it's relatively complete from a cybersecurity standpoint. Now, if you're looking at data privacy or things like that, not so much. That's why NIST came out with the privacy framework shortly thereafter. NIST CSF breaks into 5 different functions. That's that identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover that you see there. And each of those functions has several categories, resulting in 23 total categories. So just as an example, our identify function looks like this. We have asset management, business environment, governance, risk assessment, risk management, and supply chain risk management. And so you can kind of see when you look at NIST, you've got the higher level category there, or function as ID, identify, and then you have asset management, AM. And so in NIST CSF speak, that's going to be identify asset management as IDAM. Makes sense, right? Each of these categories is then further split into subcategories. So, you'll have something like this, asset management, the one that we're just looking at, and that has IDAM 1 through IDAM 6. So IDAM 1 says physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried, and IDAM 6 says cybersecurity roles and responsibilities for the entire workforce and third-party stakeholders are established. So you've kind of got these varying degrees of asset management that are kind of baked into here. And in total, there's 108 of these subcategories, or I like to refer to them as controls in this case. They're here. So I'm going to flop back over and just see. Yeah, nobody's asking questions, I don't think. No Q&A. Cool. All right, so we'll keep on rocking this. So assessing your current maturity, or at least how we did, right? There's lots of different ways to assess maturity. But what Alex and I did is we said, all right, there's this concept of a CMMI. A CMMI is basically a maturity model that says, we're going to go from we're not doing anything at all to, man, we're doing everything and we're really kicking butt at this. And we create ours based on a combination of NIST CSF and COBIT. We eventually kind of landed on these values that you see in front of you. This is very similar to what you'll find in the NIST Capability Maturity Model, or CMMC. That was released after Alex and I did this. So, I like to think that we're on the forefront of NIST CSF-NIST and CMMC. But I think the really important thing to note here is that most organizations won't ever have all, or probably even most, of their controls at levels 4 or 5. I mean, level 4, if you look at the description, it says, not only have we done everything that is established or below, it's saying that it's either audited by management or third parties, and you have consistent results, right? So you have like auditors that are coming in, they're looking at all of the processes that you've created. They're saying, yes, this is working, this is good, and your results are consistent. That's a big thing, right? To get to that point, that's a big ask. And then when you move on to step 5, you're taking it even further. These are automated processes with a closed feedback loop. So when we make some sort of an observation, we're supposed to act against that observation and then take that and feed it back in to the process so that that thing doesn't happen again. And this all has to be kind of an automated, optimized process. So you can kind of see how, when we start, we're at 0, we're not doing anything, all the way up to 5, where, man, we're doing a lot of things. So current maturity for asset management. So our next step here is that we're basically going to look at each of those subcategories. And for each one of those subcategories, we're going to look at our current capability. What are we doing today with respect to each of these things? So, according to this chart, I'm doing really, really well at asset management, physical devices and systems being inventoried, right? But that's not a hard ask, right? We can have a Nexpose tool, we can have some sort of scanner, maybe we look at network stuff and it's baked into our next gen firewalls. Automating the process of inventorying the stuff in our organization, that's probably not that difficult. But when we start going down the list and we go, oh, well, software has to be inventoried too. Okay, well, we're not doing that in an automated fashion. Who knows what Joe engineer installed on their laptop. Then we have communication data flows being mapped. Well, yeah, we kind of do that. It's a little bit more than ad hoc, but not much, right? So it's an established process. External information systems or catalog, you get the idea, right? All the way down to the last one where we're saying, man, we just flat out are not doing this thing. Now, some advice for you guys based on lessons learned from Alex and I. The first piece is be honest with yourself, right? Understanding of the environment is a gut check at times. You're going to go through this and you're going to go, oh man, we don't do that. And that kind of sucks. But what's going to happen later on is management is also going to do that. They're going to look at your results and they're going to go, why did you make this decision? And you're going to have to provide reasonable examples to support why you said that or refute it to others, because they're going to be like, well, yeah, we absolutely do that. And you go, no, you may do that, but as an organization, we don't. Stay consistent. So make sure that as you're going through, you're kind of understanding what each of those levels mean and applying it in a consistent manner, and err on the side of caution. So being too optimistic can actually cause a lot of trouble from a compliance perspective. So dial it back a little bit. And if you're kind of on the fence about something, go for the 3 instead of the 4. Because that's a lot easier to explain than why we said that, we have a optimized process or something like that when we really don't. The second piece of advice that I have here is consider your environment as a whole. When we go through this exercise, there are going to be outliers. There's going to be areas of your organization where you're like, wow, that team really does have an optimized process. But are they the exception or are they the rule, right? Don't look at your environment as just individual users or teams. How standard is this process being performed across our environment? If you went to 2 different relevant managers, would you get the same response? If the answer is no, then kind of like we said here, err on the side of caution. Don't be too optimistic, kind of go for the lower value. My third piece of advice here is be prepared to defend your responses. In our case, after Alex and I did this exercise, and this was not a simple exercise, this was not a one-day exercise, this actually, it probably took us 2 weeks to go through all the different NIST CSF responses and kind of come up with that. After we did that, we sat back down with our manager and we said, all right, here's what we said. And he went through and went like, well, that's interesting. I feel like we're doing better there. And we go, well, not really because of this. And so as you go through, keep notes, right? That will help to kind of show this is why we made this determination. This is how we're judging where we're at today. And inaccuracies are going to lead people to question the entire thing, right? So if you came in super optimistic about a certain thing, and then your manager comes in, they start going, well, what about this? What about this? No, they don't do that there. all of a sudden they start to question the whole thing just because of those one or two things that you may have overestimated. All right, let me check back and see. 4+ is expensive no matter how you swing it. Yeah, absolutely. So, Adam brings up a really interesting point, which is kind of as you go up that scale, you're actually putting out more and more money. And that's another reason why, not everybody is going to be a 4 or 5. Sometimes it's just, we don't want to. Sometimes it's we can't afford to. And honestly, that's perfectly acceptable. In the US with CMMC, the requirement is level 3 for most of those organizations. I don't know if CMMI5 is ethereal, but it's certainly a hard thing to reach, and you're not going to do it across the board. I don't think there's any organization that's ever going to be able to do it across the board. And that's probably what you meant by that, Curtis. Let's see here. So now we go and we assess our desired maturity. So we've already figured out where we're at today. Now we have to figure out where we want to get to. And to do this, we really need to understand what our current risks are. We have to understand regulatory and compliance requirements and management's risk appetite. The regulatory requirements are going to shape our minimum requirements, right? So how do we comply with all the mandatory regulations in the most efficient means possible? Our risk appetite is going to play a major part because it requires us to calibrate with management. Our overall goal here is to set our desired state to the value that gives management comfort over the risk, right? We're not just doing this for our own benefit. We're trying to figure out, what, like my boss asked me, he said, all right, create a roadmap that gives us satisfaction, right? At what point are we done? And, the reality is we're never done. We all know that as security practitioners, but at least being able to point to a place and say, yes, if we have all this functionality, then we're in good shape. So this is really hard for people that are being routinely audited. Alex and I kind of made the quote, don't let perfection become the enemy of good here. We're not trying to be perfect as we're kind of going through and doing these estimates. That's not the point of this exercise. The point of this is to create a roadmap, to come up with something that's decent, that's usable, that we can use to kind of move the ball forward. So another little bit of advice for you guys. The first thing here is be reasonable. And we kind of alluded to this earlier. Not all risks require optimized solutions. So, you don't have to be a 5. You don't have to be a 4. Sometimes being a 1 or a 2 is okay, right? So going back to here, again, another reminder here, very few organizations will ever get to levels 4 or 5 for any of their controls. My advice to you is that having your controls at kind of that level 3 is probably a good target. And that's why when NIST came out with their baselines, they basically said, or CMMC rather, said level 3 compliance is what they were looking for. All right, so now we have our kind of list of subcategories. We've got our current capability and our desired capability. And you can kind of see I've mapped them out here. So we want to make sure that we add notes, that we assign ownership. So we're documenting why we made these decisions. We're documenting who's responsible for these controls. And then once we have this, now we can start looking at risk. Now, risk in this scenario is really about gaps. What we're looking at is where we sit today versus where we want to get to. And if there's a difference in those, that's a gap, right? That's a place on our roadmap where we need to kind of close that gap in order to get to where we want to be. And so if we look here, the bottom 3, the first one, I've got manage process. I want to be established. The next one, I have a perform process. Again, I want to be established. And the last one, I'm not doing it. I want it to at least be predictable. And so we have these gaps here. So now we have to create risk. In this case, you can see IDAM5 I took as my example here. We're performing it. We want it to be established. Again, performed means that individuals are doing it, but it's defined mainly on tribal knowledge. Answers will vary between teammates. Whereas established is the owner is defined, they're held accountable for the area. You got formalized policies and procedures. So our risk here is really the difference between those. If you take like established process minus perform process, that equals risk, right? And so in this case, it's that we don't have a defined process. We don't have ownership for the prioritization of resources based on classification, criticality, and business. Pretty simple. And that literally is the difference between the current capability and the desired capability. Now, GRC. So GRC is an acronym. It means governance, risk, and compliance. There's lots of GRC tools that are out there that will help you to manage this. There's not a lot of GRC tools that are out there that will help you manage this for free. And so that kind of is why I got into the business that I'm in. SIMPLERISK is a free open source GRC platform. You can download it today, and everything that I'm going to show you, you're going to be able to do in SIMPLERISK like by the end of the day today. So we're going to kind of walk through that, but understand this isn't a talk about SIMPLERISK. This is a talk about cybersecurity maturity. And so these concepts would go with whatever GRC platform you work with. So the first piece is define controls. And with define controls, this is usually something that you're going to find in the governance side of your GRC platform, where you're basically saying, here's my framework, here's the list of all the controls that are part of this framework, and you're basically going to spell out kind of the information behind this control. So with respect to NIST CSF, we can see that this is IDAM5. We can see the information about IDAM5, what it encompasses. We've got a phase, we've got our family, so that we can kind of search and filter through those later on. And then we have our current level of maturity and our desired level of maturity, and we're able to specify those within the platform. So now that we've defined this on the governance side, now we can capture our risk. So on the risk side, and that's usually a separate module within the GRC, now we can basically go ahead and enter that risk. And so I just took literally the subject that I gave you guys before, and I copied and pasted it into my GRC tool. The next piece is to understand that risk values are going to be based on a few things. It's basically the difference between the current and desired state. So where we sit today, where we want to get to, your potential operational and financial impact given a complete failure of this process. So how bad is it going to be if we can't identify our assets or our applications or things like that? And then the likelihood of that event happening. So we go through and if you did your CISP, risk is likelihood times impact. There's lots of other formulas out there. There's ways to weight them. But ultimately, that's kind of what it is some sort of a vector mapping between how likely it is that this event is going to happen and the impact of the event actually happening. So then we go through and we populate all the other values. We can define what teams are going to own this risk. Is there a person responsible for this? We can define technologies. We can set locations. We're basically going to map this risk back to our organization, to our environment. And all of these values are essentially just pivot points. They're different ways to search or report on the data so that we can say, all right, what's a list of all the risks that Josh is responsible for? And we can pull that up. Now, your GRC should automatically calculate the risk score for you. So as you plug those values in, we can see that my particular risk here came out with a risk score of a 6. That's a 6 out of a 10-point scale, so it ends up being a medium level risk, hence the orange color that you see there. If we had a red, that would indicate higher. Yellow is usually lower. Typically, you'll see color scales like that. So our next step would be to plan our mitigation. Once we have the risk out there, we have to say, how are we going to address this? How are we going to fix this? And this ends up kind of becoming that roadmap piece, right? We have where we're at today. We have where we want to get to. We have the difference between them now that we've created the risk. And to bridge that gap, to get us to the point where we've actually, closed that problem, we have to plan our mitigation. So in this case, I'm saying that currently this is being performed by individuals on an ad hoc basis. So people are just kind of doing it randomly, when they feel like they need it. And my requirement here is that we need to document the process for prioritization of resources based on classification, criticality, and business. So we're basically saying that the only thing that needs to happen here to mitigate this particular risk, to close this control gap, is to document the process. Well, that's pretty easy, right? And we can assign this to a person, and we can even set a date that we want them to fix this by. All right, let me flip back over here, just make sure there's nobody talky. Nope. All right, cool. So now let's talk about our roadmap. Our roadmap is all about prioritization. It's how do we figure out what are the things that are the most important to us to kind of move that needle forward. And the first thing that we can look at here is the maturity gaps. So we can look at kind of where we said we are today versus where we want to get to, that current and desired level of maturity. And we can split that out by family. So, if I look at this chart here, I'm doing pretty well at asset management, but I really suck at secure engineering and architecture, right? So maybe if I look at this, when I'm starting to tell management how we're doing, I can say, hey, asset management, yeah, there's a few things that we're not excelling at, but it's no big deal because our current level of maturity is far and away better than our desired state on average. But when we look at secure engineering and architecture, we're coming out as a zero. We have absolutely no capability in this area today. And therefore, that is an area that I think that we need to focus more time, more attention, more money, more resources on in order to kind of advance the state of that. And we can even talk in terms of, these are the specific things that we're going to do. And as a result of doing those specific things, we're going to move from a 0 to a 1 next year. Not a huge change, but that's better. It's a step in the right direction. I don't have that little dot in the middle that I absolutely hate every time I look at this, right? So when we're assessing maturity gaps, we can look at the things that are below maturity, at maturity, or above maturity. Obviously, the things that are above maturity, those are things that we're doing pretty well at. We probably don't need to invest more time, more money into. But the things that show up in that below maturity area are things that we're not doing so hot at. And we probably do want to invest further in. So this is really going to help us to kind of decide where do we invest our money. Now, the next thing that we're going to want to do here is to look at burning fires. These are high priority items. So these are most likely risks that are scored by a high impact and a high likelihood. So the things that are going to end up being kind of up and to the right in our little thing with the high and the high. These are usually things that could cause serious business interruption or financial loss to the company. And at least in SIMPLERISK, we have what we call the high risk reports that can be used to identify this. So this is literally just a report that's only going to show you the high level risks in your organization, kind of the breakdown of those. So these are the fires that you want to kind of put out because those are really bad. Now, obviously, there's some kind of level of effort that you need to estimate in there. Just because something is really bad doesn't mean it's really easy to fix. And so it might take days, months, years in order to fix that particular thing. The next thing here is quick wins. So these are low-hanging fruit. And we all have these things in our organization where we look at it and we go, yeah, that would actually be really easy for us to fix. We don't need a lot of additional assistance in order to fix that. We don't need financial, we don't need to throw money at this problem. We don't need a major personnel investment. We can do this with kind of the resources that we already have. And so in SIMPLERISK, we have what we call the risk advice report that you can use to identify this. It's basically going to show you the level of effort that you specified for the mitigation mapped against the risk score. And so in this particular case, I've redacted the actual risk subjects, but here we can see our level of effort as trivial, and we can see at the top there a 3.6 risk score. So that's our low-hanging fruit. That's our quick win in this case, to be able to kind of show that we're moving the ball forward. And when I first started the risk management program, or I should say the vulnerability management program at National Instruments, this was an area that I focused very heavily on because I was able to show a very significant amount of progress in a very small amount of time. And we all want to be able to show that to our management, right? Because then they know that, hey, you're doing stuff. All right. Let's see here. So number 4, long-term work. These are thematic issues. So as an example, your company lacks formal documentation. We saw that in my particular risk. Well, maybe what we need is a project, and that project is going to go through and it's going to make sure that we have formal documentation for all of our policies, all of our processes that are out there. Well, in SIMPLERISK, for these kind of thematic issues, you can create a project and you can kind of lump the risks together into a project, and now you can manage those thematic issues kind of together. And once that issue has been addressed kind of across the board, now you can close it, and it's going to close all the risks that are associated with that. So that's kind of how we handle these things. Now, the last one here is management goals and objectives. And this is more about visibility, right? Because what happens in your organization is your company or your department are going to have ongoing goals or initiatives that everybody in the organization is kind of expected to support. and you support them in different ways based on your role. But to give you an example, before I left NI, there was kind of an active effort to try and reduce how much office space we had. And if you think about that, well, if we're actively closing down offices and telling people work from home is okay, well, that brings up some other issues that we still need to address, like remote access. If these people are working from home or working from a coffee shop or wherever they feel like working, we probably have to have some sort of a policy that says, here's how you do this safely. Here's the tools that you need on your system. You need a NGAV or an EDR platform, that's installed on your system in order to work from the coffee shop. We do not allow split tunneling when you're working from the coffee shop, things like that. And this may be a quick win that actually supports leadership's initiatives, right? Because they said, hey, we're going to try and reduce office space. You go, great. Here's the things that security can do to help you with this initiative. Another example here is if your company is trying to make a push towards increasing automation, maybe you want to provide some guidance regarding the processes needed. So like integrating optimized controls and things like that. So we say, hey, yes, security is going to help you. We're going to help build a pipeline. We're going to help to kind of funnel code through this CI/CD pipeline, and we're going to make sure that security scanners happen within this. We're doing static analysis. We're doing whatever. And now all of a sudden, we're kind of helping them to do this kind of automating thing while at the same time accomplishing our security and compliance goals. Right? So we've done both things kind of all together. Now, in terms of ownership, I guess a couple of notes here. The first is that management owns the control environment and any necessary remediation. And as security practitioners, we sometimes have a hard time grasping onto this concept, just like we have a very hard time grasping onto the concept that we don't own risk. Our role as security practitioners is to assess risk. Our role as security practitioners is to convey risk, but is not to accept risk. And that's a really, really important thing for us to recognize. I oftentimes talk to people who say, I feel like Atlas with the weight of the world on my shoulders. And if that thing happens, I'm going to get fired. Well, if you put a proper risk management program into place, then you can document these things in advance. You can make sure that proper people are signing off on them. And then those aren't really your issues. They're the organization's issues, as they should be. So management is going to own the control environment. Management owns the fixes that are going to happen. They're going to be responsible for defining the course of action to direct the projects. Us as security, we're trying to guide them. We're trying to help them along. Management is going to consult with us. And you can think of security and compliance as centers of excellence. We're providing consultative services, but we're not actually engineering. We're not actually implementing the change. There may be exceptions within organizations. Maybe security engineers are actually writing code and things like that. But far and away, the most common is that we see these guys, it's not the security team that's making the change to the operating system. It's the operating system team, the Unix guys, the network guys, the Windows guys, whatever. And we're just telling them, hey, to fix this particular issue, here's what you need to do. Now, the last bullet here is that security and compliance validate that management has effectively mitigated the identified risks and communicates overall kind of status to IT leadership. So not only are we kind of making these recommendations in terms of what we should do, we're also validating that they've been done. And that's really where kind of the audit piece, the compliance piece comes in, because we're basically able to say, look, here's where we have a gap. Management is aware of this gap. Management decided that they're just going to accept the risk involved with that gap. And so we decide that we're not going to mitigate that. But from an overall enterprise perspective, we need to be aware that this risk does exist, and that's been signed off on. So that's it. That's basically the talk. A quick summary here for you guys. The first one is you can use this technique for assessing the maturity of just about anything, as long as you have some sort of standard to base it off of. So, if you want to base this on ISO 27001 or HIPAA or high trust or, the new, as somebody mentioned in a talk earlier, that there's a new privacy thing coming out of Quebec, whatever you want to do, you can base it off of that. You just take the requirements that come out of that framework, you apply that current kind of where we sit today, where we want to get to approach, And there you have it. There's your roadmap. The second piece here is that leveraging NIST CSF is really good for assessing kind of an overall information security program. It's a great baseline. I've worked some with some of the colleges there in Canada, and they're using NIST CSF for a lot of the baseline that they're doing. So if it's good enough for them, it should be good enough for you. It's good enough for the U.S. government. We did at NI, and so on. The third thing here is it's all about determining where you are and where you need to get to. So think of this as that roadmap. Here's where we are today. There's where we want to get to, and how do we bridge that gap? And then, the last thing is really risk management is an integral part of this process. We need to make sure that we are, properly managing our risks, because when we're not, bad things start to happen. So with that, I'll kind of open it up to questions. I've kind of been looking in the chat as we went. Let's see here. So Adam says, do you see any point in calculating an overall aggregate score for, I don't know, executive reporting? If so, what's an ideal formula? Do you feel some sections should be weighted higher than others, or is it more often better to simply prioritize due to roadmap output? Okay, so big question here. Should we do aggregate reporting, I guess, is kind of the starting point, kind of executive reports and things like that? Absolutely. There's kind of two types of risk management programs. There's the IT, or kind of the focus area risk management program. And we see this a lot where in my organization, risk management sprung out of my IT group, and that's where I was running it. But there was another group that was doing risk management for trade compliance, and another group doing it for the legal department, things like that. And that's okay, right? Every organization can kind of have their own little pocket of risk management. But at some level, you have executives who want to know, what's our risk for the organization? And when they ask that question, they don't want to know, oh, we have X vulnerability on Y server. That's not the question that they're asking. And this is a place where security practitioners often get hung up on. What they want to know is kind of high level, what does that risk look like? Do we have issues with business continuity planning? Do we have a pandemic plan? They're looking at these business risks, right? What happens if our data center gets struck by a meteor and can't operate? Do we have a backup plan for that? Those are the kind of things that they're considering. And so from an enterprise level, oftentimes what you're doing is you're kind of summarizing risks. You're creating almost those projects, and you're bubbling them up to them, and they probably won't look anything like the risk that you had originally submitted into your system. And that's okay, because they care about kind of different levels of things than you're going to interact with on a daily basis. Ideal formula, use the same formula, right? You're still looking at some likelihood of an event happening, impact of that event happening. So one thing that you should keep in mind is whatever that scope looks like that you're evaluating risk in, you need to make sure that you're doing that across the entire kind of environment, right? To give you an example, if I'm a member of the Unix team and I have a system that crashes every day at noon, that might be a really high risk for me, because my goal as member of Unix team is to maintain high availability of our servers. And I can't do that if my servers keep crashing. So if I'm that guy that's the member of the Unix team, I might mark that as a 10 out of 10, right? Because that's something I care about. Now, if you move up a level and you're like IT, right? We're looking at IT now. One server crashing in an organization that has tens of thousands of servers, that's probably not as big of a deal. What if we have load balancing, right? What if we have kind of the ability to pull that server out and have another one that's operating in its place? What is the function of that server? Is it actually doing something that's mission critical? Is it supporting e-commerce transactions on a $1 million a minute website? Or is this just some server that's kind of we run a build on that once a week, right? So now we're looking at from a different perspective. Okay, well, that's going to change our risk score when we look at it in that context. Now let's drive up another level, right? Now we're looking at our executive team. We're looking at kind of the overview of the whole organization. Totally different picture, right? They don't care about that one server that's crashing one bit. That's not even on their radar. But if you told them that that one server crashing is bringing down the website and we're losing millions of dollars a day in business, that's something that they're absolutely going to care about. So kind of understand what that scope looks like, what level of magnification you're looking at it under the microscope, and that really is going to affect what that score looks like. So keep that in mind, baseline against that scope. So I guess that kind of goes to the weighting higher than others. I mean, it's not necessarily that you're weighting it higher than others. You're using the same formula. You're just making sure that you take into account kind of the scope when you're using that formula. So hopefully that answers your question there, Adam. AJ agrees, especially if that server provides an environment of minimal consequence. Absolutely. I mean, if that system being down doesn't really matter, who cares if the system is down? And this is where we start kind of moving into kind of the business continuity playing realm, where we start to look at the servers and what is the value of that server and how long does it take to bring it back up, and things like that. And Debbie, absolutely, business context matters. Let's see. Have I considered delivering the same toolkit with the CIS in 18 instead of the CSF? Absolutely. So we have the ability to do that. When I say we, I'm talking SIMPLERISK at this point, because I assume that's what the question is about. CIS critical security controls. So one thing that you have to recognize is CIS is actually a proprietary framework. And unfortunately, what that means is that you can't include the actual controls from the CIS CSC without actually paying CIS a lot of money. And in our case, with our size, it was about $20,000, which kind of seems to me like a waste of money, to be honest with you. So what we do instead is we partner with an organization called Compliance Forge. Compliance Forge has a control framework called the Secure Control Framework, or SCF. You can go to securecontrolframework.com to check it out. And it's basically like almost 1,000 controls that they've mapped across 177 different frameworks. And so things like the CIS CSC, NIST CSF, ISO 27001, you name it, it's kind of in that list of control frameworks. And it's pretty awesome having that ability, because now not only can you specify where we're at with one framework, you can actually flip that over and go, okay, well, that's the picture that it looks like for ISO 27001. What if all of a sudden we had to be PCI compliant? What if all of a sudden we had to be HIPAA compliant or whatever? You're able to kind of just flip the pick, and all of a sudden now you're seeing the controls that are part of that thing. So it's pretty cool to be able to do that. Yes, if the system is down, nobody cares, why bring it back up? Absolutely. It's kind of funny, kind of IT approach to a lot of things. And I came from an IT background, is if you don't have an owner for a system and something has to happen, maybe you're doing changes on the network and those changes are resulting in re-IPing all of the servers, and you have a server, you don't know who owns that thing. Well, what do? You turn it off and you wait to hear who screams, right? I mean, that's just the reality of things. Yeah, Timothy, you beat me to the punchline there, scream testing. Cool. Let's see. Anything else, guys? I think we're getting close to time. All right, when it comes to risk compliance, how do these frameworks and systems account for irrationality? We run into things like IT crews shirking findings or management not taking ownership when it's not in their personal interest. So that's a great question, and I think it kind of goes along with what I said earlier. The realization needs to be that we as security practitioners, I'm talking about all of us that are on here, we as security practitioners, our job is to assess risk and to convey risk. And so you will assess risk, you'll find issues, and you will convey them to management. And frankly, management will throw their hands up and say, we don't care, right? And at that point, you need to ask yourself, all right, they don't care, how am I going to let that impact me? And traditionally, and I was in this role a long time ago too, as security practitioners, we feel like it's our job, it's our duty to yell at them and tell them they're wrong until they do care. right? That's just the reality of being a security person. Unfortunately, it doesn't ever get us anywhere. Talking about the problem until we're blue in the face really doesn't fix the problem. And honestly, it doesn't make them more likely to fix the problem. So the end result of that is that we need to basically say, look, this is about risk management. I've gone on record. I've told you, here's a risk. Now we have to have some sort of a system to be able to track that. That's where our GRC comes in. And we have to be able to say, here's the risk. So-and-so, please go and sign off on this risk. Say that, you approve this risk and you don't plan on doing anything about it. Now, if that thing happens, we at least have some place to point and say, look, we assessed the risk, we conveyed the risk, so-and-so accepted that risk. And it really is business's job to assess those risks. If you get into a situation where they're not willing to sign off on that particular risk, then you need to have kind of an introspective and start to go, is this the organization that I want to be working for? And I realize that that's a hard thing to say, especially coming from the guy who's now self-employed. But at the end of the day, you need to figure out, am I a scapegoat in this organization, or am I actively working with other people to make things better? And any organization that you're a scapegoat in, you might be there a long time. You might have a golden parachute, but at the end of the day, are you comfortable with that? Is it going to help you career-wise? Is it going to, give you, when you finally leave that place, are you going to have a soft landing someplace else? Those are the kind of things that you should be thinking about there. So, Jeffrey, hopefully that gave you an okay answer to your question there. Let's see. Last one, I swear. What's my thoughts on FAIR? Okay, so FAIR, factored analysis of information risk. FAIR is what you refer to as quantitative risk analysis. So most of what we've talked about here is qualitative. We multiply this is definitely going to happen against it's really bad if it does, and we get a score of a 10 or a high, right? That's qualitative. FAIR is basically going to give you dollar values. It's going to give you ranges of dollars for that. FAIR is useful. There are certainly people out there that are going to tell you that I am completely wrong for advocating for anything that is qualitative. But at the end of the day, the realization that I had is FAIR takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources, and even the FAIR people will tell you, don't use don't use quantitative for everything that you're doing. Figure out where your biggest risks are and do quantitative analysis for that. In terms of whether it maps with SIMPLERISK, we have a customer who's kind of out in the Bay Area, and they use a customization piece of SIMPLERISK to track every single one of the vectors that they put into a FAIR calculator, and then they track kind of the results that come out of that thing. So yes, you can kind of use them in tandem. And then again, if you're not doing all of your risks with a quantitative methodology and you're using qualitative as well, then certainly having a system that's capable of both, there's going to be value there. Let's see here. Yeah, Kura said very well, if the culture of an org doesn't align with your values, it's kind of time to ask that question, right? Should I be here? Steve, why is there not a financial background? What do you mean by that, Steve? I'm curious. Let's see. Well, Steve is doing that. Let's see, any Q&A? I don't see any Q&A stuff that came up here. Okay. Well, Steve, you got a minute or so to tell me what you're thinking there. Anybody else have any questions? ART, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. Awesome. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It definitely would have sucked if I was here all by myself. But the fact that 40-something of you guys came and listened to me, I really do appreciate that. I'll be around the conference if you guys want to, ping me, send me a message. If you want to find me on LinkedIn, I'm LinkedIn/in/Josh Sokol. I think I'm at Josh Sokol on Twitter. I'm around, and I'm a pretty social guy if you guys ever want to chat. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate it, and hope you have a great rest of the conference. why is security not a function of finance? In some cases it is. So in some cases we see CISO reporting up to somebody like a CFO. In some cases we see security people reporting through IT. It really just depends on the organization, and oftentimes it depends on where somebody in the organization finally decided that somebody should do something about security. In my organization, it was 13 something years back, 15 years ago, that I went, nobody's looking at security, somebody should, and I started doing something, and eventually worked myself into a security job. It just happened that I did that under IT leadership. And then it was really hard once I did that to kind of break out and be more of an enterprise security guy. There's going to be benefits to working under finance or a CFO. There's going to be weaknesses as well. Obviously, working for the person who has the money, man, that sounds awesome, right? If the CFO is willing to give me more and more money every year to keep things secure, cool. The other nice thing about kind of the finance organization is that those guys in finance, obviously not guys, the people in finance, they do risk all the time. They understand what fraud is and things like that. And so, generally speaking, they have a good idea there. Honestly, legal is a great place for security to report into as well, right? We have a lot of requirements, a lot of regulations, things like that. One could make the argument that we should report into legal. Should we report into IT? I mean, there's a lot of conflict of interest there. There were a lot of times where, we would say, hey, here's a major issue. Actually, there was a very large data breach with a credit company here in the US. And when they got breached, the actual issue that they got breached with was something that we had recognized on our website many months before that. And I ended up having to run that up 3 chains of management, saying this is really bad. And it's literally the only time in my 13 years at NI where I went chicken little on them and said, the sky is falling if we don't fix this. And people got mad at me for that. But the end result is we didn't get hacked and they did. So, I think there's going to be times there where, like, regardless of which organization you're in, hopefully you have that chain of management that when you say this is really bad, their ears perk up and they listen. So cool. All right. Well, I'm out of time. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. And yeah, take care, everybody. Have a good conference.